Good evening, and thanks for joining tonight's TI Technology webinar hosted by Texas Instruments, where tonight we're going to take a look at some tips and suggestions for transitioning your students and yourselves to a virtual learning environment. My name is Mike Houston, and I'm the moderator for this event. I teach algebra and calculus near Pittsburgh, where I use TI technology to make those tough to teach, tough to learn concepts accessible to all my students. Tonight we're joined by our panelist, Rick Snow. Rick is a national instructor who was the first person to use the TI handheld software while teaching students in an online environment. Rick taught distance learning in Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada for over 10 years using both the TI-84 and the TI-Inspire CAS handhelds. He is now a program specialist for professional learning with a Newfoundland and Labrador English school district, whose role involves delivering professional learning in online formats using digital tools. Rick is also a nationally certified instructional designer with the Canadian Association for Instructional Design and also has a Level 1 teacher certification with Google. Most importantly, he is a husband to his wife, Joanne, and a father to a 14-year-old girl called Morgan. Rick, thanks so much for joining us tonight. We're expecting a large crowd, so your audio is muted. Feel free to send any questions using the Q&A window on the right side of your screen. We hope you don't have any audio issues tonight, but in the event that you do, try selecting Communicate from the very top of the WebEx menu and choose Audio Broadcast. At this point, Rick is going to discuss our agenda.
For virtual learning and TI SmartView in the area around synchronous and asynchronous learning, and talk about the difference between the two and perhaps how we blend the two. We're going to really focus on relationship building in the virtual environment. I'm going to show you some tricks and tips on how to set up your office. We're going to talk a little bit about assessment in the virtual environment, more specifically formative assessment. We're also going to talk about how to keep the attention and interactivity going between yourselves and your students in the virtual environment. I want to go through some tips and tricks about what would be best practices for recording videos. We'll quickly talk about developing notes with screen capture tools. We'll also include some conversations about why it's important to look at virtual office hours and things like that. And the rest I'll hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Rick. So everyone stick around to the end because we'll be giving away to one lucky winner a TCube Summer Workshop registration. So Rick, let me hand things over to you. All right, Rick, you have control.
Mike, I'm about to share my screen. Can you please let me know as soon as you are able to see the screen appear from your end?
Yep, looks good. Looks like the title slide.
Okay. Are you able to see my screen?
I am, Rick.
Good. Excellent. Okay. So let's get started, folks. So to begin, I guess we'll start by just a different way of organizing our agenda for this evening. We're going to define and distinguish between synchronous learning and asynchronous learning. For synchronous learning, we're going to talk about such things as our office setup, relationship building, interactivity, attentiveness, and formative assessment. Asynchronously, we're going to talk about some tips and tricks as it pertains to relationship building, recording of videos, and developing notes. And we'll finish off with some final thoughts. Last week, I did an interview with TI to prepare for this webinar this evening, and there are some things that they have written in their blog post that I think are important to go back through at the end of the webinar. So let's get started. Let's talk about the definitions of synchronous learning and asynchronous learning. And when we're talking about synchronous learning, we're talking about what we're looking at when we're in real time, in mutual communication and conversation with students. Okay? Some examples of some tools for that real-time communication, which might involve video and audio, or perhaps just audio and screen sharing. Some tools would be WebEx that could be used, which is the platform we're using this evening. It could be Blackboard Collaborate, it could be Zoom, it could be Skype, Google Hangouts, and so on. It's that mutual conversation, that real-time conversation. And we're also looking at asynchronous or on-demand learning. So if you're the type of person that watches recordings after webinars are over, you would be looking at content from an asynchronous perspective, learning asynchronously. And that's where things are on demand. And the teacher and or at different points in time. Google Classroom might be a place where asynchronous learning occurs. Systems like Brightspace and Moodle. There'll be discussion forums, can be Twitter and Facebook, for example. Okay. Mike, any questions or any commentary from the chat before we go any further?
Rick, nothing just yet. Thanks so much.
Okay, perfect, excellent, let's keep going. So let's start with the synchronous teaching and learning. And for here, I want to be really, really careful talking about how you should perhaps set up your office. And if you look at the setup that's in the picture here, that's my office. That's how I'm set up to be talking to you this evening. And you'll notice that I have a webcam attached, both one that I can move around and one that's stationary that's embedded in my laptop. You'll also notice that I am using what's referred to as extended desktop. What I have on my monitor is on the right side is not the same as what's on the left. It's an extended desktop, and we'll look at very shortly why I have that set up the way that I do. Okay? Ergonomics is also a big thing. You need to make sure that you're in as comfortable a position as possible. Some things to keep in mind is that whenever you're looking at a computer screen, your head should be parallel, or you should not have to look down at your computer screen. It should be straight ahead. And when you're typing, your arms should rest on the arms of your chair if you have one. And again, your arms should be parallel with your keyboard. Okay? And for me, in this example, I've got a stand-up desk attachment to my regular desk so that I can stand during this webinar this evening. And the last thing we'll look at is a writing tablet. For me, I use a writing tablet. It's a Wacom, W-A-C-O-M. It's a Wacom tablet, which allows me to pick up the pen and write on the screen. Perhaps we'll demonstrate that a little bit later. Okay. Mike, any questions from the chat?
We did. We had a question from Tina, and Tina was wondering, it looks like with that webcam that you can move and then the camera that's built in, do you ever use those both at the same time?
Most software applications, when you're broadcasting out in synchronous tools like WebEx or Blackboard Collaborate, may not allow you to broadcast two webcams at the same time. The scenario that I would perhaps use two webcams in would be using the stationary webcam or the built-in webcam for visual with face-to-face conversations over Skype or over WebEx or what have you. The second webcam that's able to be moved, think of it more like a document camera where you can move it and focus on things not straight out from your monitor, but let's say, for example, straight down. So if you were modeling something, for example, if you were using TI-84 and you wanted to demonstrate it's moving on the floor, then you could take the webcam from its position where you see it here now, and we could actually take it and point it down to the floor. Mike, I wonder, does that answer the question?
Yes, it does, Rick.
Okay, perfect. So if there's no other questions, we'll continue on. Now, why the two monitors? When you are in a synchronous call, for example, the call that we're in this evening with regards to our WebEx call, I'm able to bring the participant window and the chat window over to one monitor, and I'm able to have the applications and everything else that's being shared on the other monitor. And then using the synchronous tool, I just share the screen that I want people to see. if you're a user, for example, that uses Outlook, and you have in the bottom right part of your screen the Outlook window that pops up that gives you a preview of the messages that are coming in, if you're sharing your entire screen, those Outlook messages, for example, could potentially be seen. Whereas if you have this kind of setup, then those pop-ups will probably occur on one screen, and on the other screen is the application that's being shared. And as well, the other reason too, with some synchronous tools, when you record the session and then you publish the session, you can publish just the voice and the screen share, which means everything else is eliminated. Okay? And if there's no other questions, we'll continue on.
Yep, Rick, you're good to go.
Excellent. So earlier on, I mentioned relationship building. And I think that it's very important that as teachers transition from the regular classroom into the virtual classroom, that you keep relationship building in mind. Now, for those of you that are doing so, it's something to be celebrated. You already have the relationships established with your students. So it's a matter of maintaining and enhancing those relationships in the virtual environment. But when we're talking about virtual learning and we're talking about relationship building, we're really talking about two things. We're talking about teacher presence, and that teacher presence is the teacher as facilitator. That is the teacher as the person that asks questions. That teacher establishes the trusting environment in that virtual space. And when a teacher does that successfully, what happens is that students are more likely to ask questions and to take risks in the virtual environment. And they're more likely to help each other and answer each other's questions. That's what's referred to as social presence. So the teacher in the virtual environment creates what some people refer to as the weather in the classroom. And from there, that weather, if it's nice and sunny, then it allows for that questioning and risk-taking. Ideally, if you can do so, if at all, and this all depends on a number of factors, some of which we'll get into here, it's nice to share your video. We often look at another person's face in terms of communication, and sometimes seeing that face is enough to be able to communicate things. And as such, if at all possible, you should share your video. Okay? Because to me, it's the next best thing to being in the classroom together, is being able to see each other in the virtual environment. But that's only ideal if the internet connection that you have, and equally as important, the internet connection that your students have, can support it. Okay? So before you start relying heavily upon the visual of the face, you may want to test your internet connection and have students do the same thing. And these are one of the speed test sites that I use to test my connection when I'm in a new space, for example. If I were at a hotel, for example, I might use a speed test application to see if the internet is solid enough for me to be able to use video. Okay? The other thing I'll point out to you as well is that if you're going to be using video during a synchronous session, you may need to limit the internet access that's occurring in your house. Like, for example, as I'm doing this webinar this evening, I've instructed my family to please not stream video from Netflix so that I get all of the internet connection, or most of it, so I can dedicate it to the application sharing and the audio piece here. And there's an example of the internet speeds in my house. Ideally, you would like that number for download to be 1.00 and the upload to be 1.00 if you're going to be using video with students. And if those numbers are below that, then you may want to not use the video feed, but instead use just audio and application sharing, which we're doing here, because we're aware of the fact that some of you may not have good internet connectivity, so we want to optimize this experience for you. But if you're using audio, make sure that you use the audio in the correct way because it's crucial to developing trust. And here's why. If you have a positive, enthusiastic voice, and given the environment that we're currently in, and the fact that people are experiencing trauma, and perhaps people are anxious, and our students are anxious and suffering from anxiety in different degrees, we want to make sure that when students come to us, that's a very welcome, that's a very happy environment. And that will go a long way to creating that sense of things being normal in this environment we're in. Humor. If you're using humor, you have to make sure that it's humor that's positive, it's funny, it's something that students and yourselves will be able to enjoy. For example, in sessions, I'll often make fun of myself. And it's funny, and I'm okay with that, and the people that are in the call, whether it be teachers or students, are also okay with that. When you're dealing with adolescents, the adolescent brain, especially the front part of the brain, is still developing. As a result, you may find that adolescents, although they may laugh at sarcasm, may not really get it. And they may think that the sarcasm is being directed to them when it's not. So my recommendation in the virtual environment is no sarcasm. When you're dealing with adolescents, no sarcasm. Because adults can interpret it and know the context. Teenagers, adolescents, much less so. And the last thing is to keep in mind that the environment that we're presently in, we have people that are experiencing trauma and anxiety. So again, that positivity, that enthusiasm needs to be heard to create that sense of normalcy within the virtual environment. Just checking in, any questions, any commentary from the chat before we go any further?
Not right now, Rick. We're good.
Excellent. Okay. So, in terms of interactivity and attentiveness, are students in a virtual environment any more distracted than students in a face-to-face environment? I would suggest to you that students virtually are even more distracted because they have the internet at their fingertips, much more so than perhaps what happens in a regular classroom. So, the key to keeping things interactive, the key to keeping the student's attention is engagement. And really, that's not any different than what we would experience in our classrooms. It's very similar. But here are some tips. If we're going to look at keeping things engaging, if we're going to have interactivity and attentiveness, one of the things you might want to consider is asking some of those higher order questions. I'm going to call them thinking questions. Because if we're looking at thinking questions, then we're not simply engaging in yes-no responses that can be easily just typed into the text message or just simply used with audio. So I'm going to bring up Smart View, and we're going to look very quickly at some of the things that we could do with the software. And I just want to keep in mind, I want you to keep in mind that as we're looking at this particular activity here, that in terms of using the software, once you have the routine established by which you project the software, and in this case, it's for me sharing the screen, then all your knowledge on how to use the software applications will just come through. It's just that how you present it and how you show it to others. So for example, we've got an example here from Cabri Jr., where we've got inscribed and central angles, which are subtended by the same arc, and those that are not. So if we were to look at, for example, grabbing the point on the left here, and you can see your eyes are following my arrow at this point in time and following my mouse. If you see, if we grab that, we can ask questions as to what do you notice happening with the inscribed angle? What do you notice happening with the central angle? Okay. We can also look a little bit further and change some things up. And with the TI Smart View, we're really able to have the mathematics being visualized on the screen, just like we would in a regular classroom. So if we were to change the measure of the central angle, for example, and change that point, what happens with the inscribed angle? And at the same time, what happens if we move that point, for example, and let's grab that point. What happens if we move that, but our inscribed angle and our central angle are not subtended by the same arc? So think about the questions that you would ask students as you're doing that, as you're demonstrating the software, as you're moving things and manipulating things on the screen. And think about those higher thinking questions, you know, much more so than a yes or no. Another example, if we look at the, just let me quit here for a second. Another example would be looking at something like this, where we have a picture in the background and we're trying to model. You may ask students, well, looking at this, what kind of function models this? And students may suggest to you that quadratic. Sure. Well, what do we need to do to have this actually fit the stream of water that's there? Well, students might suggest that you actually have to reflect it first, and then, you know, you're looking at horizontal translations and vertical translations, perhaps a little bit of a vertical stretch before you get to the point where we actually have a good model. And think about all the questions that you can ask students and all the conversations that will take place as you're doing that. Okay? So let's go back to our presentation here and continue on. Another thing to keep in mind is that when students respond to you, to engage in that mutual conversation, when they give a response to you, ask them why. Keep the conversation going and ask why often. The other thing that you might want to consider is getting students to actually do the work for you. A couple ways of doing that in a synchronous environment. One is to have them write on the whiteboard. So with the Wacom tablet that I mentioned earlier on in the setup, and with a software application, and I'll bring up Smart Notebook here as an example, hopefully you can see it. With the combination of a Wacom tablet or some other tablet for writing and software application that you can share with your students, then you are able to do the same thing in the virtual environment as what you would do. My bad there. Let's erase that for just a quick second. And you can see here that we are able to model online the exact same thing that we would do in the face-to-face or regular classroom environment. Okay, so have them write on the whiteboard. You can give them control of your screen, and as a result of that, you can allow them to write as well. Or the other option is to give desktop control. For the 84 emulator, for example, you can give control of the software through the synchronous application, and they can do the keystroking for you. And that's actually a good practice, because for those of us that are proficient in using the handheld technology, we can do things quickly. Whereas if you hand the application control over to a student who perhaps is not as proficient, then that makes the pace of what's being done on the screen comparable to what the typical student would do, as opposed to somebody that has more experience and expertise in that. When you're looking at being in the virtual environment, and some of you are doing this already, and I can see that in the chat area, you're texting back messages and you're texting back things. Do we need to have voice being heard as audio? No. We can use text messages and texting in chat areas and things like that. As long as there is conversation, as long as there's mutual conversation, then we know that our students are actively engaged in the learning. Ask for feedback from the students often. You notice here that as we're going through this presentation this evening, and I'm going back to Mike to check to make sure that there's something that I'm not missing. I'm asking for feedback, checking to make sure things are good. And as well, you'll also notice that at the beginning of the webinar, I believe, before we start recording, that there was a poll that you could answer. And polling tools are really good in the synchronous environment to collect information. And Mike, on that note, I'm just going to stop for a moment and see if there's any questions or any commentary.
Thanks, Rick. So far, we're good.
Okay, excellent. So let's keep going. Formative assessment. At this point in time, as teachers, you're going to want to gauge the learning of the student, but the way that we would perhaps traditionally do it with formalized testing and things like that are perhaps not available to us at this point in time. So if you want to know if students are learning things as the learning is taking place, formative assessment is probably your way to go. Okay? And in a virtual classroom, one does have screen capture abilities. Okay? So we're going to step back into the software for a moment, and we're going to talk very quickly about how to do screen captures. Okay? So we want to create something that perhaps looks like that. Okay? So if I go to the software application, and that should be visible on your screen now, you notice that we've got some graphs here. So perhaps the first thing I'll do is that I'll turn off the first couple graphs, and we'll just have the model when it's done. If I wanted to take a screen capture of that, it's just as simple as clicking on the button here, and you can see me pointing to it on the screen. And what comes up is this window. And with this window, we are able to save. I'll select it first. We're able to save our screen captures to our computer. Okay? So once those are saved to our computer, then we can upload them into different documents, and we can upload them, for example, into Google Drive for use with Google Docs, or we can upload them either locally on our computer or perhaps use Microsoft Word to create documentation. Okay? But our example is going back to the formative assessment slide in the virtual environment. And to do that, we're going to talk about the fact that if you were to use something like Google Forms, and these are screen captures from Google Forms, Google Forms will actually allow you to upload images inside of the questions that you ask. So that screenshot that we just used the emulator to get, or the Smart View to get, once you have it captured, it can create a question that looks like this. Okay? So, and this is a question in a Google form, and on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen that I'm sharing here, I've got a link to that Google form. And I think that for those of you that might be watching this on demand, I do believe that some of the materials may be shared after. Okay, so you'll have access to that link as well. But there's the shorter form of the link to the question that we've got modeled to the right. When showing these types of tools, the question may come, could we use the same thing that we do for formative assessment, and in this particular example, screen captures and Google Forms, could it be summative? Sure. We could collect student email addresses as we're asking these questions, and if we really wanted it to be summative, we could limit to one response. Okay? We can do that. And we can also randomize the order of the questions as well. We do have the ability to do that with Google Form, for example, and other tools are comparable too. I'm just using Google Forms as an example. And could it be self? With a Google Form, you can have it so that students get the results immediately after they submit. So we can be a little bit flexible using those screen captures to create different types of assessments. And Mike, before I go any further, I just want to check to see if there's anything I've missed in chat. I haven't seen anything, but I'm just checking to make sure.
Rick, so far we're good.
Excellent. Okay, let's keep going. Now, we're going to talk a little bit, we're going to shift our focus from the synchronous side of virtual learning to the asynchronous side. And we're going to talk about relationship building. And it's in the asynchronous environment that relationship building is really important, because you're not making that real-time connection if you're only asynchronous. You're not able to hear the teacher voice. You're not able to hear the student voice. But teacher presence and social presence in the asynchronous or the on-demand environment, we can still build that. A little bit trickier to do it, and it takes a little bit more effort, but it can be built. Because at the end of the day, you want whatever virtual environment that you are in to be an environment of mutual trust, because that's when the students start taking risks, and that's when the students start asking you questions. And that's when you can dig into the learning that's occurring. One of the suggestions that I have for all of you, if you're using a tool like Google Classroom or discussion forum or Twitter to communicate asynchronously, excuse me, rather than just provide an answer outright, respond back to the question with more guiding questions so that you are engaged in the conversation. Even though it's not synchronous, it is still a conversation. It's a mutual conversation. The other thing, too, and you have to look at it from the perspective that we're all in. Right now, we perhaps have students that are isolated. They are all on their own. So when they ask you a question, from their perspective, that's the most important thing that they need answered. And when it comes to building that trust, they need to know that if they ask that question, they're going to get a timely response. So if you're going to respond at the moment that the question comes in, then you could create an unrealistic expectation that the question will be answered at any time. When you know, based on your own environment instead of at home now, that there are other demands of your time and of your attention. So a realistic response might be to let students know that when they ask a question, you'll be no more than 24 hours, for example, before they'll get an answer in return. And you commit to that, and you let them know that you're committing to a specific time frame, and you stick to it. And the other thing is that once that mutual trust is established in this environment, what you're looking at then is that you are looking at students helping each other. And you want to encourage that in the asynchronous environment. Because at this point in time, they are all separated from each other. You want to bring them back together as a class. And if you're asynchronous, this is a great way to do it. Okay? Mike, I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm just going to continue on. And we're going to talk a little bit about recording videos in this environment. Okay? So when we're talking about recording videos, and some of you may be looking at, well, how do I, in an asynchronous environment, look at recording videos and getting there to my students? And that's a question I've been answering from some educators in the last few days as we've been transitioning over to this virtual environment. So what you're looking at some kind of screencasting or recording software application. And what surprises me sometimes when it comes to virtual learning and some of the tools that we have, and more importantly, some of the tools that we think that we don't have, is that there are tools that are on machines that we're perhaps not even aware of. Okay? You may have the tool that you do not even know that you have. The example that I'm going to use is if you have an interactive whiteboard and you're using software applications that are built for that interactive whiteboard, chances are you've got the recorder already. And I'll use Smart as an example. The Smart Notebook allows you to be able to set things up so that you can record your entire desktop with audio, record an area of the screen with audio, or if you're recording how to do things on the handheld, it will allow you to record the window and just that particular application. So an example of recording perhaps with the desktop and recording with the handheld could be a situation where you set the emulator so that you only see the emulator itself, and then you set it so that the view of the emulator is up front. Okay? The view of the emulator is up front. It's in front of all the software. And in case you're wondering what that looks like, let me just quickly bring up the software, turn off some of our views here so that you can see that we can easily reshape SmartView software, and then we can have it selected so that it's always in front of whatever application we're looking at. Okay? I'm just going to bring that back to a more normal view. Just bear with me. And we'll go back to our presentation. Okay? And if you want to look at some examples of teacher-created videos that were created using Smart Notebook and that recording tool, our district website here in Newfoundland and Labrador has some of those math videos, just for your information and perhaps for your interest. Recording videos, anybody can press play, or press start and press end, and what comes out of the video. But you want to optimize the learning that occurs from that video. So there are some things I want you to keep in mind. If you find a recording tool that you like, it's easy to use, and you're ready to move forward. The first thing is your voice. There is no problem whatsoever with enthusiasm. Make sure that if you're passionate about mathematics or you're passionate about science, that when you're recording a video, that passion comes across in your voice. You can be clear, be enthusiastic. And contrary to what you might think, talking fast is okay. And if you think about when you record your videos for your students are used to you talking the way that you normally talk in a class, which is perhaps a bit faster than what you might think you have to do during a video recording, but it's the same. You're fine. What you want to avoid is that monotone, robotic sound of your voice because you're trying to make sure that you're pronouncing everything and you're going really slow, because that can cause the user to be disengaged from the video very quickly. Okay? The other thing to keep in mind, and some of these other tips comes from Dr. Richard Mayer's research in cognitive theory for multimedia learning. And it's the whole idea that things that are in print format, in video format, or multimedia format, if they're not relevant to the learning and they're put on the screen or the paper or the digital form, they can be distracting. So if it's not relevant to the learning, leave it in. Sometimes less is more, and keeping your video recordings clean and simple are perhaps the best way to go. So, which means that you optimize the real estate of the recording screen. Don't think that you got to put everything onto one screen. You can use multi-screens. For example, if you were recording Smart Notebook, then you would have multiple pages in your Smart Notebook, and you would release one page at a time, as opposed to running everything on one page. Okay? The other thing you really want to do is that you want to create your video in such a way that the person watching the video is following the movement with their eye. That can be using handwriting to create your video. It can be bringing things in step by step with something like a PowerPoint. But what you don't want to do is to have, for example, an entire mathematics solution presented on the screen and then just voice that over. Because there's nothing for the eye to follow, there's nothing to catch the attention of the eye. This may be problematic for some of the mathematics content that we teach, but I'm going to stress that if at all possible, keep your videos short. Get to the point. And if you think about it, when a student clicks on a link, they don't need to be introduced to what's in the video already, because they've clicked on the link, they know what they're looking for. so you can get right into the learning right away. Okay? So the point is, get into what it is that you're recording and get out as fast as you can. Which means that if you're looking at things from a lesson perspective and you have your actual structured lesson, example 1, example 2, example 3, that shouldn't be 1 video, that should be 4. And if you think about things from a differentiation perspective and an individual student need perspective, you may have students that may only need to watch the first example, and they've successfully attained the curriculum outcome. You may have other students that may need to watch all 4 or all 3 examples or what have you. And that's good for them. So by breaking it up in smaller chunks and having, very short videos, it allows for the student to decide what it is that they need to look at without the fear that they're going to miss something if they don't continue on back to the end of the video. Okay? Some other things to keep in mind, if you're going to record your class, for example, we're recording the video here. Looking at taking a recorded class and then separating it after or chopping it up after, that does not always flow so well. And if you think about what happens in the dynamics of a classroom and where you're answering questions and things like that, then if you chop those things up, then the video can sound and flow more disjointed than if you're recording it separately and specifically recording smaller snippets. Okay? Also, look at the tool that you have. With the Smart Notebook Recorder option, you can select a region of the screen. Do you need to record the entire screen? If not, then select the region and optimize that screen real estate for that video. Okay? Another thing to keep in mind, and this is very important, is that the brain really has 2 channels for receiving information. It's what you see and what you hear. And you'll notice sometimes in presentations that perhaps people read exactly word for word what's on the screen. That can confuse the brain because the same information, the brain is trying to process the information, the exact same information from 2 different formats, and it can get confused. So the best thing when you're looking at that is not to read directly off the screen, but use the screen as your jump-off point for what you're going to discuss. And think about the end user, and think about the video that the person is going to watch. Is it going to be on a computer? Is it going to be on a Chromebook? Is it going to be on a tablet? Or is it going to be on a small smartphone? And that's where the optimizing the screen and the real estate really comes in. Before we go any further, I haven't had a chance to look at the chat. Are there any questions that we need to address?
Rick, everything is good.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Okay. So let's talk quickly about developing notes with screen capture. And I'm going to go back to that whole idea of redundancy. If it's not a part of the learning, don't include it. Make sure that your notes contain the information that's relevant to the learning, and we don't necessarily need to make things more decorative when it comes to learning objects. Okay? Something else to keep in mind too, some teachers will produce their notes from their synchronous class. In a regular face-to-face classroom, it might be saving the notebook file at the end of the class. For online virtual things, it may be saving the whiteboard, for example. But you got to look at those notes. When you've written those synchronous notes, those notes in class, are they clear? Is there a flow to them? Or, can somebody take those notes independently and get the gist of the lesson? If they can, great. If not, then you may want to look at supplementing those notes with something else. And look at screen captures perhaps as a way of doing that supplementing. And again, optimize your screen, optimize your real estate. You don't need too much information. Use multiple pages if necessary. And given the fact that we're in digital environments, we don't have to worry about our trees per se, about producing too much paper from our end. So use multiple pages if you have to. Can your notes be printed and act as a standalone resource? And that's important because we're really looking at things from a socioeconomic perspective, and we may need to produce something that students can print off, and when they do get access to the internet, or if the internet connection is not fast, to be able to just print it off and use that for their learning. So developing good notes may be key to addressing that part of our classroom dynamic. Okay? So we're going to look at a Google Doc example. And the example we're going to look at, I've got a Google Doc here for quadratics. And I'm just going to open that up now, so just bear with me for just a second. And you'll notice as this document opens up on your screen that I've just got the bare bones of a document. So for example, if you look at what's on the screen here now, we started out with the empty screenshot that I used earlier on. Then we added the parabola y is equal to x squared. Then we reflected it. Then we translated it horizontally, translated it then vertically, and then we have the curve that's fitting here. But if we want to look at perhaps using the screenshots to be able to enhance notes, there's perhaps a couple things that we can look at. I'm just going to go back to the software, and that should be coming up on your screen now. So when we look at our screen captures, and I'm just going to put it on the desktop here. Okay. So when I put this on the desktop, and I'm just going to open up my capture here now, just bear with me. I'm going to open it up with a good old program that perhaps people are not quite aware that maybe on their machine, and maybe they do. And it's Microsoft Paint. Okay? With Paint and screen captures, we can do a whole bunch of really neat things. We can resize, make our screen captures bigger. Actually, let's resize it and make it even bigger still. And with any good screen capture, perhaps we might want to do perhaps some annotations. Okay, we might want to add some text. Okay. And if we do those kind of things to our screen captures, then we have the ability to save them and then import them into different documents in the same way that we did it here in this particular document. Okay? So again, utilizing the Smart software and the functionality of it to be able to get you the things that you need in the virtual environment, so that when you're presenting things asynchronously through something like a notes format, that you're able to do so and do so quite easily. And I think the annotation piece is huge to the screen captures, because it allows you to be able to really point out things that the student may need to put their focus on. And again, looking at that eye piece, if you annotate and you point to things, that's where the eye will go. And it becomes a much more powerful learning document as a result. So, Mike, before we go any further, any questions or any commentary that we need to consider?
Not this time. Everything's looking good, Rick.
Excellent. Okay. So, last week I had the opportunity to be interviewed by TI for this particular webinar and the one that was hosted last night. And, you know, basically it was, okay, virtual learning, you have some experience with it, what would you suggest? And one of the first things I suggested was to be patient. And you have to consider the trauma and anxiety that we're all feeling globally at this point in time. And you have to think about the fact that we all, or a lot of us, left our classrooms very abruptly. And we never really had time to prepare for the virtual space that we're in now. As a result of that, I think that, you know, for some of you, you might just be starting to get into the online instruction. And if you're just starting to get into the online or virtual instruction, anything that you're doing at this point in time, you should celebrate as a success. Because you've started, you're getting there. And with that as well, you should also realize that not everything that you do the first day is going to be absolutely perfect. You have to give yourself some space and some grace, and you have to give yourself some credit for the success that you're just starting to have, and to be patient as you move forward. Your proficiency in that transition from the face-to-face environment or the regular classroom into the virtual classroom will happen. Give yourself some time, give yourself some grace, be patient, but celebrate your success. The second thing that I suggested was around relationships, and you've heard me refer to this earlier in the webinar from the synchronous side and the asynchronous side. Build the relationships first. Let's take our time to make sure that our students are positive and comfortable, that we're positive and we're comfortable, that we're talking and we're engaged, and then we can start talking about curriculum outcomes. And the curriculum will come, the learning will come, but let's focus on the relationship first, and let's create that positive environment, that environment of mutual trust. And again, structure creates connection. And this goes back to earlier in the webinar where I suggested the whole idea of virtual office hours. Let's make sure that we have structured things happening. If it's asynchronous, make sure that there's a structure in the time that you respond. If perhaps it's synchronous, then perhaps you can have office hours posted in your calendar where students can join you in a synchronous call, and you can react and work with things more one-on-one. But structure will create that connection. The next one is let them hear you laugh. And I will tell you that when I first started as a distance education teacher, I flew into a remote community, and I got to meet the students that I had never seen before. I had the opportunity to meet them face to face. I went into their school. And what they told me at the end of the meeting was that I didn't sound near as mean in person as what I did online. And that really took me back from a relationship perspective. And I realized that students had to hear me being happy and had to hear me being a person as opposed to just solely focus on curriculum. So I made laughter a part of my classroom as much as I possibly could. And I suggest that you create that positivity as well. And the last one is embrace this situation that we're in as an opportunity to test, to try, and to explore. You may find that after this is done, that you have an entirely new skill set and toolkit for that when things do return to normal, and they will return to normal, give it time, that you will have a different skill set. And the things that you learn now, you will probably bring into back to your regular classroom and bring back to your students of the future. And Mike, I'm going to leave it at that. If there's any questions or what have you, I'll certainly answer them. But I think I've covered everything that I think that's important for the transition from online or from face-to-face to virtual.
Rick, thanks so much. As we begin wrapping things up tonight, if you do have any last-minute questions for Rick, please try to get those asked. I know he'll do his best to try and get those questions answered. We're excited that there are some T-Cube summer workshops being offered around the United States, and more information can be found on our website, education.ti.com. This is a great way to extend your learning over the summer, possibly learn new things or refresh some other learning. We also mentioned at the beginning of the webinar tonight that we're giving away to one lucky winner a T-Cube summer workshop, and tonight's lucky winner is Roberto Navarez. So Roberto, congratulations. We hope to see you as well as everyone else at a T-Cube summer workshop. Roberto will be contacting you over email in the next couple of days to give you a little more information. If you're watching this webinar on demand, go ahead and copy that link into your favorite browser to receive your certificate. Feel free to stay connected with us on Facebook, Twitter, or any of the other major social media outlets. When you leave the webinar tonight, a brief survey will automatically appear in your browser, and your feedback guides us as we plan future online events. So we really hope you share your thoughts in the post-webinar survey. And if you're in need of any other feedback or you have any questions, feel free to give us a call at 1-800-TI-CARES or drop us an email, ti-cares@ti.com. We'd love to hear from you. Rick, thanks so much for everything you shared tonight. I know you put this together on very short notice. Again, thanks so much for everything you did.
Anytime, Mike.
And thanks, everyone, for joining us. We hope to see you back online real soon. Have a great night.